All right, good afternoon. Happy Good Friday. So here's a gift for you, church. Surprise. We thought we'd do a Good Friday service on our own. And what a blessing. If you had one more night to live, if you had 24 hours left, what would you do? Would you eat? Some people prepare, they want their last meal or whatever. Who would you choose to be with? A lot of times, people in their last hours, they want to be surrounded with their family. I find it quite interesting that in Jesus' last hours, he thinks not about realizing his dying wishes or ticking off a bucket list, because some of us do that too. If we knew we had some certain amount of time, we might make a bucket list. But it was about preparing his disciples for what was ahead. It was knowing through all of this, his betrayal, his arrest, his trial, and he knows beforehand that his execution is imminent. But Jesus is determined to show them the full extent of his love. John 13:1. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. And having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And now was ate the Passover feast together in the upper room in Jerusalem. And it was joining with countless thousands of Jews throughout history, remembering God's great rescue, because that's what the Passover is, of his people from slavery in Egypt. Jesus does something that's shocking to show him there's love. What I want to do is I want to actually go through the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. And it's recorded in Matthew 26 and 27, and Mark 14 and 15, Luke 22 to 23. And then the biggest part of this is where most of this is going to come from is from John 11 to John 19. And that's what I want you to do this tonight, tomorrow, Saturday, is actually read that. Read through John 11 to 19. It is just full of activity. And so the last day of Jesus' life seems to have started after Judas agrees with the Jewish religious leaders to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So this is about the afternoon, Thursday, probably around this time, about 1:30. Possibly. What he's doing is he goes and tells the disciples to prepare for the Passover. He sends John and Peter to prepare it. And then a little bit later in the evening, or it comes a little bit later, they go. They go into the upper room where the Last Supper starts. So this is Thursday evening. And Jesus and the disciples arrive at the upper room. And as they're arriving in the upper room, Jesus does something. He washes their feet. Jesus took a servant's towel and put it around his waist. He poured water into a bucket and he began to wash their feet. And we need to realize how shocking this would have been for the disciples, right? Because first, feet are gross, they're disgusting, right? They've been picking up filth and all the feces from Jerusalem streets in an ancient society before modern sanitation and sewage, and they were generally in sandals. Second, in society, servants were low, and it's no doubtably shocking for Jesus, their master, to take the lowest position in society and do the most menial and degrading task. And of course, the disciples object, and Peter says, "You shouldn't wash my feet. You shall never wash my feet." But he says, if you're going to wash my feet, I want you to wash my whole body, right? See, that's not their picture of greatness in their mind. Jesus should be ascending to the throne of Israel and bringing kingdom with God, with power, right? But this is not Jesus' way. Jesus' idea of greatness is not ascending the ladder of power, but descending to use his power for the good of others. And he takes the lowly position of a servant to wash his disciples' feet. And in doing so, it gives us a picture, a foreshadow of what his death will accomplish for us. And just as water washes away the filth of Jerusalem's streets from their feet, his blood will wash us clean. All our shame, all our guilt, all our sin, and all our filth is washed away by the blood of the cross. And we are made perfectly and permanently clean in God's sight. So then they're sitting at the supper, and Jesus announces that one of his disciples is going to betray him. And then the supper officially begins. And Jesus announced that he's longed to eat this Passover with them. So he takes the cup and he blesses the cup of wine. And then he breaks bread and identifies himself as the unleavened bread. And then he announces a second time that one of them is going to betray him. This is troubling to the disciples, right? And then Jesus identifies Judas as his betrayer, right? By dipping his bread in Judas's cup. But the disciples do not understand this until afterwards. And then Judas leaves to betray Jesus. And this sets in motion the events that will lead to Jesus' execution. So when Judas came to priests on the night of the Passover, they were likely surprised. So as he's leaving and he's going there and he reaches over to the priests, they're probably surprised, greatly alarmed, and not really prepared to seize Jesus, right? They were ready to condemn him that night. But they just gathered whatever they had. They scrambled to do whatever it took to kill Jesus before rumors of their conspiracy leaked. And the events that followed were driven by hatred and fear, and were disorganized, confused, and illegal. So as this is happening, Jesus is pouring a second cup of wine, and he identifies himself as the Passover lamb. And then he pours another drink of wine, and he says, I will not drink it until he is with the disciples again in his kingdom. And so this is about after sunset at the supper, so they're in the upper room. Now they're probably lazing about, they're kind of just talking amongst themselves, but the disciples start arguing about who's the greatest. And Jesus reminds them that true greatness about it, right? That you shall be the least, and the least shall be the greatest, as he's discussing his kingdom. And he tells them then about this commandment to love one another. And Jesus informs Peter, he's like, Satan's demanded to sift him like wheat, but he's prayed for Peter so that when he turns back to Jesus, he will encourage his brothers. Now Jesus informs Peter that he will deny him the first time. And Peter promises that he would die for Jesus the first time. But Peter tells him he's going to deny me 3 more times. You're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. Right? And then Jesus informs the disciples that he's going on a journey. And then they question him, and he answers them with the multiple assurances and admonitions. And so this is a bit in the evening there. So now it's getting into the nighttime, and Jesus and the disciples are singing hymns, and they depart for the Mount of Olives. And so now they're on the streets in Jerusalem, and they're going in there. And Jesus announces that all his disciples are going to abandon him. Jesus tells them that to meet him in Galilee after he is raised. And Peter promises, most likely the second time, that he's not going to deny Jesus. But Jesus reminds Peter that he will deny him 3 times. And this is where Jesus teaches that he's the vine and the disciples are the branches. And then Jesus reminds the disciples to love one another as he has loved them. And then he tells them as they're walking there, and he says, Jesus just reminds them that the world will hate them as it's hated him. But Jesus also tells them in this part that he promises to send the Holy Spirit. And then as we go on, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection and promises his disciples that everything will turn out for good. And then Jesus stops and he prays for his disciples, his protection and sanctification, and for believers to have all unity and to share in his glory. And now they reach the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus asks the disciples to enter the garden. And he asks them to keep watch and pray. So this is all of them. And Jesus goes further into the garden. He takes Peter and James and John with him. And they go into a place of prayer. But the disciples keep falling asleep. Right? And Jesus here, his soul is greatly troubled. And he asks God to take the cup from him. But he wants to do God's will. And an angel attends him. So Jesus wakes up the disciples and he goes back to prayer. And they fall back asleep. So Jesus awakens his disciples a 3rd time and informs them that he's been betrayed. He says, oh, my attacker, my betrayer is coming. And so here comes Judas, right? This is about after midnight-ish. So he's spending several hours in prayer with his disciples. And this is about after midnight now. Judas comes up with the group of the Jews and the chief priests where he was, in order to arrest him. And they're armed with a whole Roman escort. And Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. And then Jesus asks them, the armed crowd, who they seek. And they answer, Jesus the Nazarene. And Jesus responds, I am he. And they fall to the ground. And then he asks this of them a 2nd time. And when they answer, Jesus tells them that he is the only one they seek, and they should let the others go. And during this time, Peter attacks those who have come to arrest Jesus, cuts off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. And Jesus miraculously heals it and reprimands Peter. And he says, put your sword away, Peter. And Jesus submits to his arrest, while the disciples run away. So now as they are leading him back into the house of Annas, the whole mob has Jesus. The disciples have all split. They've all ran away. Jesus is rushed to the house of Annas, where he's interrogated and the abuse starts. Peter and another disciple follow Jesus from afar, and Peter denies being his disciple the first time. Now we get back to the second part of this religious trial. It start in the dark morning of the hours. Now they go to the house of Caiaphas. And Jesus brought to Caiaphas the high priest. So he's sitting the high priest, where he's falsely accused of many things before the Sanhedrin. And when it appeared that the council would not be able to substantiate any charge, Caiaphas intervenes and stages an occasion for Jesus to commit blasphemy. And he's charged swiftly and condemned. And then the priest, the elders, the scribes, and officers abuse him and mock him. Here again, Peter denies being Jesus' disciple the 2nd and the 3rd time. And from there, Jesus looks, because Peter's still afar watching what's going on. And Jesus looks at Peter as a rooster crows, and Peter runs away bitterly. So this is just before the dawn, just before the light is coming. Judas regrets his decision. And he tries to undo it by returning the bribe money to the priest, and they don't accept it. They say, that's at your hands, your feet. And he throws it at their feet, and he bitterly runs away. And in his remorse and in his guilt, Judas hangs himself. And now at this point, this is the first signs of light. The dawn is coming up. And Jesus is in trial now before the Sanhedrin. And as soon as it's declared to be dawn, the religious council, the Sanhedrin, confers their council chamber to officially convict Jesus of blasphemy. And then it goes into the first phase of the civil trial. Now they bring him to Pilate. So the Sanhedrin's got him. Now they're taking him to Pilate. They're taking him there. And so the priests send Jesus to the Roman prefect, Pilate, before whom they accuse Jesus of insurrection and claim he deserves to be executed. And Pilate investigates these accusations by personally interviewing Jesus with the praetorium, and he finds no guilt in him. And Pilate declares Jesus' innocence to his accusers, and they protest. Here Jesus is silent. And when Pilate learns that Jesus is a Galilean, he sends up to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. So now he's sitting before Herod. And this is just at the beginning of dawn, the early morning hours, and now he's in Herod's palace. Jesus is silent before Herod, whose initial excitement fades when he does not perform a miracle on demand. It's like, prove it, show me who you are. After dressing him as a pretend king, mocking him further, Herod returns Jesus to Pilate. Here comes the third phase of this civil trial. Now we're in early morning hours. When the trial reconvenes at the praetorium, Pilate reaffirms Jesus' innocence to the gathering crowd, knowing they won't like this verdict. The governor promises to punish Jesus before releasing him. This extraordinary gesture is Pilate's first attempt to release Jesus. And the priests balk at Pilate's offer, and Pilate addresses the wider crowd the first time by countering that he will use his customary Passover pardon to release Jesus, the King of the Jews. And the Passover pardon is Pilate's second attempt to release Jesus. Pilate's wife warns Pilate about the troubling dream she had, but the chief priests and elders persuade the crowd to ask Pilate to release Barabbas instead. And so when Pilate offers the crowd the choice to release Jesus or Barabbas, at the persuasion of the priests, the crowd chooses Barabbas. And he's surprised by their response. And Pilate asks them what he wants them to do to the King of the Jews. And the crowd answers, "Crucify him." Surprised by their response, but still wanting to release Jesus, Pilate has scourged, hoping that the brutal punishment of a man declared to be innocent will satisfy the crowd. And here the Roman legionnaires beat and mock him as a king by putting a robe over him and pressing a crown of thorns on his head. And so Pilate brings Jesus, presenting he's bloodied, this pitiable King of the Jews. Said, "Behold, man." He declares his innocence, but the crowds persist. And at this point, the Jews introduce a new charge, a charge of blasphemy, and insist that he must die because he pretended to be the Son of God. And this troubles Pilate. So Pilate is exasperated. He's investigating and he's interviewing Jesus a second time in the praetorium. And Jesus remains silent as Pilate desperately tries to find a reason to release him. And when Pilate threatens Jesus with his power, Jesus calmly reminds the governor where his authority and ultimately accountability reside. And here Pilate his efforts, he makes the best effort to release Jesus a fourth time, and the crowds ignore it. Instead, the crowd put Pilate into a diabolical dilemma, forcing him to choose between following Roman law and releasing Jesus, or being branded an enemy of Caesar by releasing him. Not wishing the trial to drag out any further, Pilate sits down upon the judgment seat to bring things to a close. And then Pilate puts the Jews in a dilemma of their own when he says, "Behold your king," as he presents Jesus. And he knew it would be distasteful to the Jews to acknowledge Jesus as their king. But if they denied that he was their king, then he would functionally agree with Pilate that he was innocent of the charges. Rather than do either, he chose to commit blasphemy by declaring, "We have no king but Caesar." And then if their efforts to have Jesus crucified, this was Pilate's fifth attempt to release Jesus. And he's seen that there's nothing he can do to convince the crowd, and that a riot is starting. In a final appeal to release Jesus, or in an effort to acquit himself of the sin that he was about to commit, Pilate publicly washes his hands before the crowd, and he declares his innocence. And he says, all the people who sense that Pilate is ready to give them what they want, he declares, "His blood shall be on us and our children." And Pilate relents, and he releases Barabbas and orders Jesus to be crucified. See, Pilate gave the crowd the choice to release a notorious criminal named Barabbas or release Jesus. But the crowd chanted for Barabbas' release. So Pontius Pilate released Barabbas and sent Jesus to the cross. So now it's about mid-morning. So that's a lot happening in a short period of time, and no rest, and so much going on in all this point. So this is mid-morning, just outside the city gates, where the Romans lead Jesus toward the place of execution, where he carries his cross. And Simon of Cyrene is pressed into carrying Jesus' cross, possibly because Jesus is too weakened to carry it himself. And here Jesus tells the women weeping for him instead to weep for their own children. And so here we go. We arrive at Golgotha around the 6th hour to the 9th hour, which is about 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock Friday. Upon arriving at Golgotha, Jesus is offered wine and vinegar to dull the pain, and he refuses it. Jesus is nailed to a cross, placed between two criminals, and his crime, "This is Jesus, this is the King of the Jews," is written on a board posted on his cross. Jesus recites this phrase, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." And his clothes are divided according to lots by the Roman soldiers. And then Jesus is even further mocked by religious scoffers, his executioners, even the criminals being put to death beside him. And one criminal repents, and Jesus assures them that he will be with him in paradise. Then Jesus asks his disciple John to take care of his mother after he's gone. At noon, darkness falls upon the entire land and lasts until about the 9th hour, which is 3 o'clock. At the 9th hour, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And Jesus says, "I'm thirsty." And he's offered a sponge of sour wine. And then Jesus says, it's finished. And then he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. And in that place when he says, he cried out in a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he died. And then he willingly died. He completed his task. And at that moment, the veil in the temple is torn from top to bottom. The earth shakes, and dead saints are raised. And the centurion that's standing guard confesses that Jesus was the Son of God. And all of Jesus' followers who were looking at him from a distance, along with the woman who came with him to the cross, they're all devastated. Their friend, the Messiah, is dead. And just to make sure, then they poked Jesus' corpse, pierced with a spear. Blood and water pour out of his body. And so later in the afternoon, just outside the city gates of Jerusalem, Joseph of Arimathea gets permission from Pilate to take Jesus' body down from the cross and bury it in a nearby tomb. And Jesus' body is hastily taken down and prepared with burial spices and laid in the tomb. And Jesus' tomb is sealed with a large stone. Jesus died at 3 o'clock, Friday afternoon before the Jewish Sabbath started. He was buried that afternoon in a cave. And a squad of Roman soldiers guarded the tomb to prevent anyone tampering with the body. I don't know about you. That sounds like a heck of a 24 hours. And that's our Jesus. Selfless. Not wanting any that should perish. Praying for his disciples, showing them what it means to follow him and what it means to follow God wholeheartedly. Jesus was the perfect Lamb of God who took away the sin of the world. And now we can have our sins removed by believing in him. This is the key event in history. God became like us to rescue us. Jesus said, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. John 13:15. And he gives us a new commandment to love one another as I have loved you. This was a demonstration of love, sacrificial love. And as we reflect on Jesus' final days and his hours this Good Friday, let us receive God's love and cleansing afresh. And may his love for us overflow in our love for one another. Because Jesus demonstrated his love and how to love others. Let us contemplate these 24 hours. Because we also know 3 days later, Jesus returns to life. May you have a blessed Good Friday. And just remember how much God does love you.